The rain battered the house that night, rattling the windows like impatient fingers drumming on glass. I sat at the window, watching droplets race each other down the pane, my breath fogging the cold surface. My parents had rushed out hours earlier, muttering about some emergency at work. They'd said they wouldn't be long, but as time crawled by, the emptiness of the house grew heavy, pressing in on me. I'd been left alone before, but tonight felt wrong. The storm was vicious, the wind howling around the house, shaking the trees and making the windows shudder in their frames. The darkness outside felt thicker than usual, like it was pushing up against the glass. Every creak of the old place set my nerves on edge. I tried turning on the TV, hoping noise would help, but all I got was static, a snowy, crackling screen that only made the room feel more eerie. The lights flickered on and off, as if the power itself was struggling to decide whether to keep going or give up. A sharp knock at the front door snapped me out of my thoughts. My heart lurched. Nobody should have been out in weather like this. I hesitated, the remote still in my hand, then slowly got up. The knock came again, harder this time. I edged to the door and peered through the crack as I opened it a little. A woman stood on the porch, soaked to the skin, rainwater dripping from her clothes and hair. For a moment I didn't recognize her. Then it clicked. She was the new neighbor who'd moved in a few houses down. We'd exchanged a few words days ago, nothing more. Now she was here in the middle of the storm, standing on my doorstep. Her eyes were wide, almost wild, and her wet hair clung to her forehead. She smiled, but it was wrong. Her mouth curved, but her eyes didn't change. "Are you alone?" she asked. Her voice was barely audible over the rain. The question stunned me. Why would she ask that? Something in her tone, in the way she stared at me, made my stomach twist. I nodded before I could stop myself, not sure what else to do. She tilted her head, studying me for a moment. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away into the darkness, the rain swallowing her figure until she was gone. I slammed the door and locked it, my heart hammering. Her question echoed in my mind. "Are you alone?" I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she'd been worried. Maybe she'd wanted to check on me. But the way she'd vanished without another look, without even saying goodbye, it didn't feel like concern. It felt like something else. I went back to the living room, but the TV no longer held my attention. The house felt different now, like it was holding its breath. I kept glancing toward the front door, half expecting another knock, but the only sound was the relentless roar of the storm. An hour dragged by. Slowly, my tension started to ease. I told myself I was being ridiculous, letting my imagination run wild. Then I heard it. Footsteps. At first they were faint, just a soft creak from above, easy to dismiss. But then they grew clearer, measured, heavy steps crossing the floor directly overhead. Someone was walking around upstairs. All the blood seemed to drain from my body. I knew I was alone. My parents wouldn't be back for hours. Nobody else had a key. The footsteps continued, room to room, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was up there was searching for something or someone. Panic surged through me. I bolted for the front door, but just as my fingers closed around the doorknob, the footsteps stopped. Silence crashed down. A thick, suffocating silence that made it hard to breathe. I forced myself to look back toward the stairs, certain I'd see a figure standing there. But the top of the staircase was empty. Just the dark hallway, stretching away into shadow. I swallowed hard and started up the stairs, each step feeling like it took an eternity. The air felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing against my skin. At the top, I paused, listening. Nothing. My parents' bedroom door was slightly open. I nudged it wider. Two men stood inside, their backs to me. They wore dark clothes and the shadows obscured their faces. I'd never seen them before. A bolt of pure fear shot through me. They hadn't noticed me yet. I didn't think, didn't speak. I just spun around and ran. I flew down the stairs, half sliding, hearing them burst into motion behind me. Their footsteps thundered down the hall as they gave chase. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. All I could think about was the door. My hands shook so badly I fumbled with the lock, but somehow I got it open. I tore outside into the storm, the rain hitting me like icy needles. I ran and didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, lungs burning, clothes plastered to my skin. With shaking fingers, I pulled out my phone and called the police, stumbling over my words as I tried to explain. By the time officers arrived, the men were gone. The house was empty. Upstairs, they found signs of a break-in. Drawers yanked open, belongings scattered, things rifled through. But there was no trace of the intruders. No fingerprints, no clues, nothing. Standing outside under the flashing red and blue lights, I couldn't shake the sick feeling curling in my gut that this wasn't over, that they'd be back. Or worse, that in some way they'd never really left. I've always thought of cemeteries as peaceful places. Somewhere to say goodbye, to remember, to let the dead rest while the living stand quietly above them and think. For years, I visited my late wife Eliza's grave every Sunday. It became my ritual, my way of feeling close to her after she was gone. But one visit changed how I see that place forever. It was late afternoon when I pulled up to the cemetery. The sky was a smeared gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. The wind cut sharper than it should have for that time of year, knifing through my jacket and settling into my bones. I parked at the entrance and walked the familiar gravel path. The crunch beneath my shoes was the only sound. I knew the way to Eliza's plot without looking. Each turn had become muscle memory. As I approached, I noticed a man standing a few rows away, close enough to see his outline, too far to make out details. I didn't recognize him. People visited graves all the time, but something about him made the hairs on my neck stand up. He wasn't facing any particular headstone. He was facing me. I shook it off and knelt at Eliza's grave, brushing away leaves and stray bits of grass. I talked to her like I always did, about the kids, my week, how much I missed her. But the man stayed in the corner of my vision, still, watching. I tried to ignore him, but it felt like having a stranger standing in your doorway, saying nothing, just staring in. After a while, I stood and stepped back, ready to leave. That was when I realized he'd moved. He was much closer now, and I hadn't heard a single footstep. My heart sped up as he approached. Up close, his clothes looked worn and dirty. His eyes were wild, a glint in them that I couldn't place, something like rage or raw desperation. "Got any money?" he rasped. It wasn't a question so much as a demand. His voice was rough, scraped raw, with none of the politeness you'd expect from someone asking for help. "I don't have any cash on me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It was the truth. I never brought money here, I never needed to. He stared at me like he could see through the lie even though there wasn't one. He took another step forward, eyes narrowing. "Don't lie to me," he hissed. "Everybody's got something. Give it to me." I shook my head automatically. "I don't have anything for you," I repeated, firmer this time. He moved closer, blocking my way back to the car. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a man hoping for a few coins. Something mean and volatile simmered under the surface. The air seemed to thicken. The cemetery, once a place of comfort, suddenly felt hostile, like the statues and headstones were witnesses waiting to see what would happen next. I glanced around, hoping to spot another visitor, a groundskeeper, anyone. But the place was deserted. Just me, this man, and the dead. "Give me what you've got," he said again, louder now, anger building in his voice. The way he looked at me, it was like he was right on the edge of snapping. My mind raced. I knew I couldn't fight him. He was younger, stronger, and clearly desperate. "I'm leaving," I said, trying to sound calm. My voice shook anyway. I stepped sideways, attempting to get around him, but he mirrored my movement perfectly, still blocking me. The rows of headstones felt like walls closing in. My heart hammered. Panic rose like a tide I couldn't hold back. "I'm warning you," he growled, dropping his voice. There was a madness in his eyes now, a dangerous gleam that made my blood go cold. He wasn't going to let me walk away. Not empty-handed, and I had nothing to give. Terror like I hadn't felt since the day I lost Eliza washed over me. I turned and ran. My body moved before my brain fully caught up. Instinct took over. I heard him shout something behind me, but I didn't stop to hear what it was. The gravel sprayed under my shoes as I sprinted down the path, my breath loud in my ears. The sky above darkened, clouds closing in as though the world itself were shrinking. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so hard it took me 3 tries to get the door open. I dove inside, slammed the locks, and started the engine in one frantic motion. When I looked up, he was gone. He'd vanished as if he'd never been there at all, leaving only the echo of his voice and the image of those wild eyes burned into my mind. I drove straight to the police station, heart still thudding, thoughts spinning. I told them everything. The cemetery, the man, the threats, the way he blocked my path. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but I saw the look they gave each other. Maybe, to them, he was just another vagrant hassling people for money. A few days later, the police called. They'd found him. Only he wasn't alive. His body had been discovered in the cemetery, partially pinned beneath a broken grave. His neck was twisted at an angle no human body should allow, eyes wide open, frozen in whatever he'd seen last. There were no signs of how he'd wound up there. No broken ground, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the earth had simply opened and claimed him. They asked if I'd noticed anyone else that day, if I'd seen anything unusual. I told them the truth. It had just been the two of us. Him, me, and the graves. I still visit Eliza, but only in broad daylight when the sun is high and other people are around. Still, every time I walk down that path, I feel it, a prickling awareness, like eyes watching from between the headstones. And some nights, when sleep comes hard, I dream of those wild eyes again and hear that rough voice demanding something I'll never be able to give. Before we move on to the next story, if you're hearing these tales for the first time, consider subscribing to our channel and turning on the notification bell so you don't miss the upcoming scary stories. Your support helps us keep sharing them, so please pass them along to friends and family as well. Thank you. We'd been planning the camping trip for months, just me and my friend Jake, deep in the woods, far from city noise and crowded trails. The forecast called for clear skies, and the idea of nothing but trees, stars, and silence sounded perfect. We reached the trailhead at sunrise. The forest was drenched in golden light, the air cool and sharp with the smell of pine and damp earth. We tightened our packs and started down the narrow trail, weaving between tall trunks. The canopy above was so dense it turned the sunlight into shifting patterns on the ground. As we hiked deeper, the outside world faded. No traffic, no voices, just the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional distant bird call. The trees grew taller and thicker, their bark rough and ancient, their branches knitting together overhead like fingers. After several hours we found it, a small clearing carpeted with soft moss, ringed by trees so thick it felt hidden from the rest of the world. There were no fire pits, no trash, no signs anyone had ever camped there. It felt like our own secret spot. We set up the tent, collected firewood, and by the time the sun started to slip behind the trees, our camp was ready. As day drained into night, the forest changed. Birdsong faded and was replaced by a steady chorus of crickets. Our fire crackled, tossing flickering shadows across the trunks. The warmth felt comforting against the creeping chill. We ate, joked around, and let the quiet soak in. The sky above the clearing was a scatter of bright stars, clear and sharp. Eventually we crawled into the tent, exhausted from the hike. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire outside had burned down to glowing coals, casting a faint red light through the tent walls. The forest was unnervingly silent. Then I heard it, soft, deliberate steps in the clearing, a light crunch, then another. I sat up, suddenly wide awake. Jake snored quietly beside me. The sound came again, closer this time. It could have been an animal, I told myself. A deer, a fox, but something about it felt off, too measured, too slow. I eased the zipper down and peeked outside. The clearing was dim, everything washed in shadows. The embers glowed faintly. The trees stood still and black around us. I scanned the area, heart pounding, but saw nothing moving. I was about to close the flap when I noticed the ground just beyond the light's edge. Footprints. They were deep and clear in the soft earth, the impressions fresh, leading straight toward our tent. Too big to be an animal, too new to have been there before we arrived. My breath hitched. We hadn't seen another person all day. We were miles from the nearest road. I shook Jake awake, whispering his name. He grumbled, then saw my face and snapped to attention. I pointed to the prints. His expression shifted, confusion giving way to fear. We sat in silence, straining to hear. That's when the chanting began. At first it was barely more than a murmur, so faint that if we hadn't been listening, we might have missed it. A low, rhythmic sound that didn't quite sound like normal speech. The words were slurred together, the tone flat and monotone, like someone repeating the same phrase over and over. It grew louder, drifting toward us from the direction of the footprints, from the dense trees just beyond our camp. The sound wrapped itself around the clearing, seeping into the air. I felt a cold sweat break across my skin. Jake and I looked at each other but said nothing. The chanting came closer, more insistent, yet still impossible to understand. My chest felt tight. Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then a figure stepped out from the trees. He was tall and bone-thin, his clothes hanging off him in ragged, filthy strips. His long, matted hair covered most of his face, but what I could see of his eyes made my blood run cold. They were hollow, empty, like nothing human lived behind them anymore. He swayed slightly as he walked, lips moving in that same eerie chant. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it seemed to fill the clearing. We were frozen, crouched in the tent doorway as he drew closer, eyes unfocused, words spilling out of him like a broken record. Then, without warning, he lunged. His arms shot forward, and his chant twisted into a guttural, animalistic scream. We toppled backward, scrambling over each other in blind panic. Jake's hand closed around a half-burnt branch near the fire. He swung it up, the embers flaring bright as they caught the air. He jabbed it toward the man like a torch. The figure recoiled, letting out a low, feral growl. For a heartbeat, something flickered in those dead eyes, fear, anger, something I couldn't name. He whispered one last word we couldn't understand, then turned and ran, vanishing between the trees as quickly as he had appeared. We didn't hesitate. We grabbed what we could, just our packs and flashlights, and bolted, leaving the tent and most of our gear behind. We tore through the black forest, branches whipping our faces, roots catching at our feet. Even after the chanting stopped, it echoed in my mind. By the time we stumbled back to the trailhead, dawn was breaking. We collapsed on the ground, shaking and exhausted, too drained to speak. Later, when we reported what happened, the authorities didn't look surprised. They told us about a man who'd been living out there for years, performing strange rituals, harassing campers who strayed too far off the usual paths. We never set foot in that forest again. Even now, years later, when I think about that night, I can still see those empty eyes and hear that droning chant, rising from the dark between the trees. The storm pounded the road as I drove home from my late shift, the wipers dragging useless arcs across the windshield. Sheets of rain turned the world into a blurred smear of gray and black. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness. Beyond that, nothing existed except the roar of the storm and the hum of the engine. I was bone tired. All I wanted was a hot shower and my bed. The road twisted through the countryside, lined with dark trees bowing under the wind. Occasionally lightning tore across the sky, lighting up the landscape for a split second before plunging it back into blackness. As I rounded a bend, my headlights picked out a figure on the shoulder. A man standing in the rain, arm out, thumb extended. He was drenched. Water streamed from his hair and clothes. He looked utterly miserable, utterly alone. I slowed down instinctively, my heart rate spiking. I knew better than to pick up hitchhikers in the middle of the night, but leaving someone out there in that storm felt wrong. I hovered between brake and gas, debating. Drive on and live with the guilt, or stop and hope it didn't turn into something I'd regret. I sighed and pulled over, tires hissing on wet gravel. The man approached, his face mostly hidden in shadow. I leaned across and unlocked the passenger door, my hand trembling slightly. "Thanks," he muttered as he climbed in, shaking rain from his sleeves. "No problem," I said, forcing my voice to sound casual. "Where you headed?" "Just up the road, gas station," he replied quietly. "You can drop me there." I nodded and eased back onto the highway. The car felt suddenly smaller with him in it, the air thick with unspoken tension. He stared straight ahead, saying nothing. The rain hammered the roof, washing away any real possibility of small talk. I snuck a glance at him. Tall, dark hair plastered to his forehead, plain clothes, nothing notable. But there was something off in his face, too pale, his eyes dark and unreadable. Minutes slid by in heavy silence. I could feel him there, rigid beside me, as if waiting. My skin prickled. I kept my attention locked on the road, resisting the urge to keep checking on him. At last, the gas station appeared ahead, its flickering neon sign glowing weakly through the rain. I'd never been so relieved to see such a dingy place. "This is it," he said softly. I pulled up near the entrance. He opened the door and stepped out without another word, vanishing into the curtain of rain. As the door shut, I felt an immediate sense of release, like a weight had been lifted off my chest. I exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. Then I saw it. A crumpled, damp piece of paper sat on the passenger seat where he'd been. I didn't remember seeing him pull anything from his pockets, but the note was there, unmistakable. Curiosity and something darker got the better of me. I picked it up, fingers shaking, and unfolded it. The ink was smeared, the handwriting rushed. "Check the back seat." The words punched the air out of my lungs. Very slowly, heart thundering, I turned my head toward the rear. The back seat was a pool of shadow. The weak glow from the gas station sign barely reached inside. My eyes adjusted, tracing the outlines of the empty seat. No movement, no shape, nothing. I snapped my gaze back to the front, breathing hard. Was it a sick joke? Had there been someone back there before? Had I driven all that way, with more than one stranger in the car? My skin crawled at the thought. I slammed the door locks down with clumsy fingers and stared straight ahead, watching the rain streak down the glass. The neon sign outside flickered, throwing strange, broken shadows across the wet pavement. I wanted to gun the engine and get as far away from that place as possible, but the note sat on the passenger seat like a living thing, its warning digging into my mind. The man had seemed odd, but not overtly threatening. At least not at first. So why the warning? And why did it feel deep in my gut like I still wasn't alone? I shoved the note aside and put the car in drive, hands unsteady. The storm only grew worse as I pulled away, rain slamming against the windshield like it wanted in. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something move in the shadows behind me. The road ahead was empty. The world outside, swallowed by darkness. But that feeling clung to me, that sense of another presence just out of sight. I pressed my foot harder on the gas, as if speed alone could save me from the memory of the man I'd picked up, and the one I might have never seen. I've been driving trucks for over a decade. The highway is more home to me than most places I've lived. Just me, the engine's steady growl, and miles of asphalt stretching out under the stars. I've seen strange things on the road, but nothing like what happened that night. It was around 2 a.m. on a lonely stretch of highway. The sky was pitch black, the kind of darkness you only get far from any town. Now and then, another vehicle passed in the opposite lane, headlights flashing past and disappearing. My eyes were heavy from hours of driving. The next rest stop was still 50 miles away. I was counting down the distance markers, just trying to stay alert. As I rounded a bend, my headlights swept over a figure standing on the shoulder. At first I thought it was roadkill or debris, something that had fallen off a vehicle. But as I got closer, I saw it was a man. He stood unnaturally still by the side of the road, head down, a long dark coat hanging around him like a curtain. It looked far too heavy for a warm summer night. Something about him felt wrong, but I told myself not to be ridiculous. I'd seen plenty of odd characters out here over the years. Maybe he'd broken down. Maybe he needed help. I slowed the truck as I came up beside him, not because I wanted to offer him a ride, but because I couldn't quite bring myself to just barrel past. No car, no lights, no sign of a breakdown, just him and the dark. I rolled to a stop a few feet away. He didn't move, didn't even turn his head. I tapped the horn, a short, sharp blast. His head snapped up. For the first time I saw his face. I wished I hadn't. His skin was ashen, almost luminous in the beams of my headlights. His eyes were wide, but there was nothing behind them. No warmth, no life. Just emptiness. Every instinct screamed at me to drive. Instead, I hesitated. Slowly, he raised an arm and pointed down the highway, as if asking for a ride in one simple gesture. I don't know why I opened the door. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was something else in his dead eyes I couldn't quite read. Whatever it was, I reached across and unlatched the passenger side. He climbed in without a word. His movements were stiff, deliberate. The door thudded shut, and suddenly the cab felt too small, the air too dense. I shifted back into gear. For a while, the only sound was the engine and the low hiss of tires on pavement. I tried to break the silence. "Where you headed?" I asked. He didn't answer, didn't even look at me. He stared straight ahead, hands clasped in his lap. That's when I noticed his hands. They were coated in something dark. At first I thought it was dirt, but in the dim glow from the dashboard it looked too thick, too dark, almost like dried blood. My heart started pounding harder, loud enough that it drowned out the hum of the road. I kept glancing sideways at him, trying not to be obvious. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to breathe. The darkness outside felt heavier the longer we drove, like the night itself was pressing against the windows. My headlights lit up only a narrow strip ahead, everything else was swallowed whole. Finally, I tried again. "You okay, man?" No response. I raised my voice. "Hey, you hear me?" Still nothing. Then very slowly, he turned his head and looked at me. His eyes met mine and my stomach dropped. They were bottomless, like looking down a well with no end. All the tiny, familiar lights inside the cab seemed to dim under his gaze. Then he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It stretched too wide, too slowly, twisting his face into something that did not look human. A cold, oily wave of fear slid over me. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles went white and pressed harder on the gas. The engine roared, the truck surging forward. I kept my eyes fixed on the road because I knew that if I looked at him again, I might lose my nerve, and maybe more than that. The rest stop sign finally appeared in the distance like a lifeline. A few more miles, just a few more. But the closer we got, the more oppressive his presence felt. I could feel his gaze on the side of my face like a physical weight. The air grew colder. The darkness inside the cab seemed thicker than the darkness outside. At last, the rest stop came into view, its lights a dim cluster on the side of the road. I pulled in fast, brakes squealing slightly as I brought the truck to a hard stop. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he turned to me again, the smile gone, his face blank, empty. Without a word, he opened the door and stepped out into the night. He didn't look back. In a few strides, he melted into the shadows beyond the reach of the parking lot lights. I sat there, breathing hard, staring at the open door he'd walked through. It took a long time for my hands to stop shaking, longer still to convince myself to get out and walk into the rest stop building. Even now, when I'm driving alone at night down some forgotten stretch of highway, I still think about him, about those empty eyes in the glow of my dashboard. I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere, standing on the side of some other dark road, waiting for another driver to slow down. It was a Friday night and I was looking forward to doing absolutely nothing. I'd eaten dinner, cleaned up, and settled onto the couch with a book. The house was quiet, the kind of old house quiet I was used to, a random creak here, a sigh from the wooden floorboards there. As I turned a page, my eyes drifted to the coffee table. The vase sitting there looked off, slightly crooked. I was sure I'd centered it earlier. I shook my head at myself. Maybe I was being overly particular. I reached out, slid it back to where it belonged, and went back to reading. but the feeling that something was wrong clung to me. Every few minutes I'd look up, scanning the room as though I expected to catch something in the act. An hour later, I got up to grab a snack. When I walked into the kitchen, I froze. The silverware drawer stood open a couple of inches. I stared at it. I was almost obsessive about closing things fully. I was certain I hadn't left it like that. My fingers trembled as I pushed it shut. I told myself it was the draft from the old windows or that I'd been distracted and forgotten. Reasonable explanations. That's what I needed. I went back to the living room, but I couldn't relax. My eyes darted from object to object, hunting for something else out of place. By bedtime, my nerves were frayed. In the bathroom, brushing my teeth, I noticed the hand towel on the floor. It had been neatly folded on the rack. My pulse quickened. My reflection in the mirror looked as unsettled as I felt. The rest of the night, little things kept shifting. My keys, which I distinctly remembered leaving on the kitchen counter, ended up on the hallway table. A picture frame on the shelf was now tilted. My shoes had moved just enough that I knew I hadn't nudged them by accident. Each small change tightened the knot in my chest. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was deliberate. I decided I needed proof. Something I could look at in the light of day and tell myself one way or the other if I was losing my mind. I owned a small hidden camera I usually used to check on my dog while I was at work. I set it up in the living room, pointed so it covered most of the space where the strange little changes had been happening. It was late. Exhaustion tugged at me, but the idea of sleeping while something, or someone, might be moving around in my house chilled me. Still, I couldn't stay awake forever. Finally, I forced myself into bed and left the camera recording. The house felt too quiet. Every creak of settling wood sounded amplified. I lay there in the dark, heart pounding, until at some point exhaustion finally dragged me under. When I opened my eyes the next morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My first thought was the camera. I rushed to the living room, grabbed my phone, and pulled up the footage, my hands shaking. The video started normally enough. There I was, moving around the house, adjusting things, going through my routine. Then I turned off the lights and went to bed. For a while, nothing happened. Then, not long after I'd left the room, the motion sensor picked up movement. A figure stepped into view from the hallway. A man. Thin, his clothes hanging loosely from his frame. He moved cautiously, as if he'd done this many times before and knew exactly how far he could push his luck. He scanned the room, head swiveling, eyes darting. Then he walked up behind the couch, the same place I'd been sitting earlier. He stood there, just stood there right where my back would have been, his head tilted slightly like he was listening for something. Then slowly, he turned and looked directly at the camera. His eyes were wide and unblinking. For a second, I couldn't breathe. The knowledge that he had been inside the house, behind me, watching me, that he could have been there for days, weeks. My hands shook so hard I dropped the phone. When I picked it up again, I forced myself to keep watching. After a minute or two, he left the living room and headed back toward the hallway. Just before he disappeared from view, he glanced up at the ceiling. My stomach twisted. The attic. I called 911 with fingers that barely obeyed me, doing my best to explain what I'd seen without dissolving into panic. The wait for the police felt endless. When they finally arrived, 2 officers went straight for the attic. I stayed downstairs, rooted to the spot, every cell in my body screaming to leave but unable to move. They found him there, huddled in a corner. He was homeless, they told me, and it looked like he'd been living up there for weeks, maybe longer, using the house whenever I was asleep or out, moving things, watching. They led him past me in handcuffs. As he walked by, he looked at me with a strange, almost sorrowful expression, like he wanted to say something. I just stood there, numb with relief and revulsion. That night, I couldn't even consider sleeping in that house. I stayed at a friend's place, replaying the footage over and over in my head. The way he stood behind the couch. The way he stared into the camera. The way he had probably watched me countless times without me knowing. I never went back to live there again. My name is Kevin, and I used to work nights at a small downtown office. It was a simple job, updating reports, organizing files, making sure everything was ready for the morning crew. Most nights I had the whole place to myself. I didn't mind. I liked the quiet. On the night everything changed, it was a typical Wednesday. I sat at my desk, the only light coming from my laptop screen and a small desk lamp. The rest of the office lay in dim shadow. The low hum of the air conditioner was the only sound. It was around midnight when something started to feel off. At first I chalked it up to fatigue. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, my head ached, and words were beginning to blur together. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and kept typing. That's when I noticed the reflection. In the dark part of the laptop screen, beyond my own faint reflection, there was another shape. A darker blur behind me. I stared at it, thinking it was a trick of the light. I turned around, expecting to see one of the few other night workers wandering through the space. But the office was empty. I listened. Nothing. My heart sped up. I told myself it was just my mind playing games. Long hours, poor lighting, easy recipe for weird reflections. I sat back down and tried to focus. But every minute or so, my gaze drifted back to the screen. The shadowy figure was still there. It didn't move. It just lingered like a stain behind me. Unease crept up my spine. I got up and walked a lap around the office, checking cubicles, the break room, the conference room. Everything was exactly the way it should be. No one else was there. I felt slightly better until I sat down again and looked at the laptop. The figure's outline was clearer now. It stood directly behind my chair in the reflection, taller than me, its form just a shade darker than the surrounding gloom. I whipped around. Nothing. The air felt heavier, like the room had shrunk. I could almost feel eyes on the back of my neck. I decided to finish my work as quickly as possible and get out of there. I typed fast, fingers flying over the keys, trying to ignore the reflection. Then the lights flickered. First a soft blink from one of the overhead fixtures, then another. The room dimmed, brightened, and then went dark entirely. My laptop screen glowed in the sudden blackness. In that pale blue light the reflection sharpened. The shadow behind me wasn't a vague shape anymore. It was a figure, tall, dark, edges hazy but clearly human. It loomed directly over my shoulder. I froze, muscles locking. I couldn't bring myself to turn around. The air grew cold. I could feel something behind me even without seeing it. A presence. Heavy and suffocating. My breathing went shallow. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my limbs wouldn't listen. Very slowly, I reached out and brushed the edge of the screen, hoping the simple action might snap me out of it, or shut the laptop and erase the reflection. The figure moved. It stepped closer. Its outline grew sharper. I could almost make out a face, pale and blurred as if seen underwater. Its features twisted in a way that made my skin crawl. I snapped. I shoved back from the desk so hard the chair toppled. I grabbed my bag without even thinking and bolted for the door, the slap of my shoes echoing down the empty hallway. I didn't dare look back. Just before I reached the exit, though, I made the mistake of glancing over my shoulder. In the dim glow from my abandoned laptop, I could see the figure standing at my desk. It faced me, motionless as if watching me flee. I didn't stop moving until I burst outside. The cold night air hit me like a wave. I stood there on the sidewalk, panting, staring up at the blank windows of the dark office. It felt impossible, like a bad dream, but the fear lacing through me was real. The next morning, I sent in my resignation by email. No explanation, no details. I just knew I'd never sit in that office at night again. To this day, I don't know what I saw. A ghost. A hallucination born of exhaustion. Something else. All I know is that whatever it was, I never gave it another chance to find me alone in that building. I still don't know why I agreed to go into the old building. Maybe it was pride, wanting to prove I wasn't scared. Maybe it was that stubborn curiosity that pushes you toward things you should stay away from. The place had towered over the edge of town for as long as I could remember, a hulking, rotting structure that everyone said was haunted. Shuttered windows, sagging roof, stories whispered by kids who dared each other to go near it. I didn't believe in ghosts. At least that's what I told myself. It was a cloudy night when I finally went. The moon hid behind thick clouds, casting everything in a dull, colorless glow. The wind whistled through the trees lining the dirt path that led to the building. Each step made my heart beat a little faster. The front door was long gone, leaving a jagged, splintered opening. I stepped through and felt the temperature drop instantly. The air inside was thick and stale, like it hadn't moved in years. My footsteps echoed through the first room. Dust lay on everything in a heavy layer. Broken furniture slumped in corners, half buried. Strips of wallpaper curled down from the walls, revealing cracked plaster beneath. The smell of mold and rot was strong enough to taste. I moved slowly, sweeping my flashlight beam across the room. Every sound made me jump, the creak of floorboards, the skitter of something small in the walls. I kept muttering to myself that it was just an old building. Old buildings made noises. The hallway was narrow, the walls closing in like a throat. My flashlight flickered and I smacked it with my palm until it stabilized. At the end of the hall, a door hung slightly open. I hesitated, then pushed it wider. The room beyond was larger, almost empty. Broken windows lined the far wall, letting in gusts of cold wind that made tattered curtains billow and twist like they were alive. I swept my light across the floor. Something moved in the far corner. At first I thought it was the fabric, or a trick of the light against the wall. But then it slid slowly along the floor. It wasn't the wind. The shadow had shape, not quite human but close enough. It was darker than the darkness around it, as if someone had cut out a piece of the night and set it there. I went cold. My mouth went dry. I couldn't move. The shadowy figure stood still, yet I felt its attention on me as surely as if it had eyes. There were no features, no face, but something icy and sharp pressed against me like a gaze. I wanted to bolt, but my legs refused to obey. Then it began to move. It glided across the floor, no footfalls, no sound, coming straight toward me. That broke the spell. I turned and ran. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly as I tore back down the hallway, the house groaning and creaking around me. The darkness seemed to stretch and twist, reaching for me. Somewhere behind me, I heard a faint rustling that swelled louder, as though something was closing in. I stumbled through rooms that all looked the same, tripping over debris and broken wood. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. The building felt like a maze, corridors folding back on themselves. Then I saw it, the jagged rectangle of the front entrance. I threw myself through the opening, hitting the ground outside hard enough to scrape my palms. The cold night air flooded my lungs. I scrambled to my feet and spun around. The figure stood just inside the doorway. It didn't step out. It didn't chase me. It only lingered in the shadows of the threshold, a darker patch in the darkness, watching. Even from a distance I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing against my chest like a weight. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road, legs aching, heart pounding like it would burst. When I finally looked back, the building was just a looming silhouette against the sky. Silent, still, empty, but I knew better. I never told anyone what happened. Never went back. Yet sometimes, on nights when the wind is still and the world is too quiet, I feel that same cold weight settle over me again. That sensation of being watched from just beyond where the light reaches. A reminder of that night, and of the darkness that waits, patient and silent, right at the edge of the light.